I'm Paul Giannasi. I lead the Government Hate Crime Programme. Just to explain what it is, and then I'll explain what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. The Hate Crime Programme was brought around in response to the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. Everything that exists really in relation to hate crime policy and legislation in the UK has its roots in the inquiry into the murder of Stephen Lawrence. In 2005, Government commissioned a review of where policy was going in response to the recommendations in the inquiry, which reported in 1999. And there was a sense that everybody was doing good things, but everybody was going off in different directions. And there was kind of, the police and the CPS had different policies, different definitions of hate crime. So there was a sense that there needed a coordination, and I was brought in to coordinate that response. So I don't dominate or control or have responsibility for any particular element of the policy. And what my job is to really kind of try and make sure that the policies are cohesive. So I lead on lots of the proactive stuff. I also, because I'm a career police officer and was seconded in as a police officer, and I'm not anymore, but I was seconded in as a police officer, I obviously have more responsibility for police policy, and I wrote the manual that sort of gives the guidance to police officers. So I'm going to talk through and give a kind of, if you like, my commentary. So where it's policy, I'll kind of mention it, but if you take it as my views rather than government views, that would be much easier for me, because I'm going to talk about some fairly contentious sort of issues. So I'm going to talk about where we are, and I'll make out a case that the UK is the strongest in responding to hate crime of any state, probably in the world, but certainly in the Northern Hemisphere. And then I'll tell you how bad we are compared to what we should be and where we should be, which doesn't augur well for the others who are lagging some distance behind. And then I'm going to talk specifically around the referendum and the particular challenges that are brought around in relation to hate crime. So what I'm going to start off with is just going through and talking about what a hate crime is. So if you lined 5 criminologists up and asked them to define hate crime, you come out with 6 definitions. There is no consensus. There are people who vehemently oppose hate crime as a policy, say that it leads to a 2-tier response, that it doesn't, that it depresses and oppresses the majority in favour of the minority. There are lots of people who would oppose to it. So what I'm not going to do is say that this is the definition. What I'm going to say is this is the UK's definition and the police's definition and the prosecutor's definition, and what we accepted it. So hate crime, as far as we're concerned, is taken to be any crime where the victim is chosen because of a hostility to something about their life, be it a characteristic, be it something which is intrinsic about their life, so their ethnicity, their religion, and so on and so forth. And you can see that definition, targeting somebody who is attacked because of hostility to something about their life, would fit gang-related violence or football violence. So that isn't what we mean for hate crime. It's largely about power, more often than not. Whilst the majority are covered in exactly the same way and have exactly the same protection as the minority, hate crime traditionally and historically has really been about power and the protection of the weaker in society from the stronger. So one of the first issues we grapple with is we don't mean hate, and a hate crime is a term that even that isn't clear, and there isn't unanimous agreement about where the term comes from. Lots of people think it had its roots in the 1960s civil rights movements in the US, but others say that it was actually coined, a term first coined by women's rights groups who were protesting against misogynistic hostility in the 1940s in the US. So there's a different view depending on who you speak to, but the reality of it is that we would probably choose a different term if we were starting from scratch, because for one main reason, the term hate implies a level of hostility at the upper level of what you would recognise, and we don't have to prove that. We have to prove that there was a crime, and to get an enhanced sentence, which I'll come on to, we have to prove that the offender was motivated by hostility, which is a much lesser emotion. So yeah, in the absence of a legal definition, the DPP gives guidance, and the guidance says to take the dictionary definition, which includes the words unfriendliness and meanness. So you've got a crime first, and then you've got some element of hostility, be it unfriendliness, meanness, or antagonism, for instance. We have a human rights-based approach, so religious hate crime covers atheists. It covers an attack by somebody from one sect on another. Groups of gay men walking around a park beating people up for being heterosexual would be a sexual orientation hate crime. It may not happen, but the legislation and the protection is human rights focused, which takes away some of the arguments against hate crime policy. There was a couple of key principles in the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. The first one is about perception-based recording, and this is relatively unique. There's only Ireland in the Northern Hemisphere that takes the same approach. But obviously it isn't for somebody to perceive that an action is a crime. The crime is obviously the matter for the law. But if an action is a crime, then we record as a hate crime when the victim or any other person perceives it to be hostile, motivated by hostility. And that is controversial. It's hugely controversial from people who say that it provides people the right to get a better service than everybody else gets. So we don't think that happens. We monitor for degrees of manipulation of the data, and the only coordinated experience we have of anybody trying to do that was from a far-right group who had a campaign called Racism Cuts Both Ways, which was really saying that hate crime is racism was what happens to white people. But it's controversial, but we do it because we're talking about recording. If we want to get an enhanced sentence in court, we have to find the evidence to prove that hostility. So it's quite conceivable that we would record as a hate crime, but that it would be prosecuted as a simple crime, simply because we can't find the evidence to back up that. But what's really important is that the police will recognise it as and will record it as will the prosecution service. The other fundamental principle, or one of the other fundamental principles from the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, was about the importance of non-crime incidents. There is a view from our advisory group that nobody commits a racist murder as the first offence. There is always an escalation from lower level hostility and offending. So the really important part of this is that if we can deter the escalation of that behaviour by education or diversion or enforcement, then we might just stop the tragedies happening in the first place. So we record 5 strands of hate crime. What we defined in 2007 when we came together to define this is not the definition of hate crime. We specifically said it was the definition of monitored hate crime, because what we wouldn't want to do is to deny the existence of other types of hostility, but what we had to do was draw a line around what we were going to measure when we measured hate crime. So why is it so important? We know it has a greater impact on the victim. I'll give you some data for that, and that it affects the wider community, including community tensions. I can't overstate the importance of the confidence in the police and the state of getting this right and not getting it wrong. And my son is a detective sergeant in Manchester with 10 years service, and he still gets challenged by people who say that you won't deliver me a fair service because you are institutionally racist. So the actions of police officers when Dan was 7 years old and in junior school are still affecting the confidence in his ability to deliver fair services. So the importance of getting it right is significant for that reason alone. We know it affects preventing escalation and seriousness, but it's also a legal duty. As well as the law and the powers that we have a legal proactive duty in the UK that under the Equality Act to say that everybody who takes money from the public purse has got the responsibility under Section 149 to consider the need to eliminate the harassment of people based on their protected characteristics, so protect them from hostility, and to promote good relationships. So whether you're an educator, whether you're a health official, whether you're a local authority official, you have a responsibility to positively and proactively do what you can to stop hate crime. It's a government priority, particularly the issue of underreporting, and I'll come on to why that is the case. So, in terms of the journey, the UK is one of the most multicultural societies, we know that. And there was a breakdown in the relationship, particularly with the Black African Caribbean communities in the 1980s. The Scarman report, which I don't need to recite to you, but it covered the issue of the Brixton disorder, which was one of the first. But through the 80s, in 84 and 85, we saw a significant breakdown of public order, and some of the violence was racially divided, should I say. Similar issue in 2001. So the murder of Stephen Lawrence was really key to this in terms of it was the focus. Stephen's murder wasn't high profile in 1993 when he was murdered, but around about 1995, 96, because of the tireless campaigning of his family and the support of people like Nelson Mandela, the profile of Stephen's murder was significantly enhanced. And it was enhanced because the failings of the state to deal with it effectively and the failure to bring justice for the Lawrence family. In 1999, the public inquiry led to a change in the way we deal with everything. In my 30 years of policing, it was significantly the biggest change in culture, in policy and legislation, in any respect. So it wasn't just about racism, it was about the way we deal with intelligence, it was about the way we engage with communities, it was about the way we investigate major crime. All of these were affected because of the failings of 1993. I just want to mention a couple of others which have an impact and perhaps an explanation about that journey. In 2003, Johnny Delaney was killed, a young traveller lad in Elmsmere Port. He was attacked by a group of youths in a park who beat him, and he died of his injuries. And one of the offenders was witnessed to say, he deserved it, excuse the language, he's only a fucking jippo. The police recorded it as a racist hate crime because traveller is an ethnicity legally in this country. The police recorded it as a hate crime, the prosecution service prosecuted it as a hate crime, but during the trial the judge made it clear that he was treating it as a murder inquiry and not as a racist murder. And there may have been legal reasons for that. I don't seek to make a comment on that, but it is impossible to go to gypsy traveller camps anywhere in the country, or gypsy traveller groups anywhere in the country, and talk about hate crime without them referring to Johnny Delaney and a view that it gives them that their rights are not protected in the same way as other minorities. So it's really important what we say and how we say it when we deal with hate crime. There was two horrible murders in 2005, murder of Anthony Walker in Liverpool, which most people know about, the murder of Jodie Dabrowski, a young gay man in London who less people know about. But they were important because it was the first time that we could measure the response to the changes that had been brought around, or one of the first times, because of the similarities to the murder of Stephen Lawrence, because of the progress that's been made. And whilst I wouldn't be as naive as to say we got it right every time in 2005, but getting it right had a significant benefit. Both Jodie Dabrowski's mum and Anthony Walker's mum will both say that the criminal justice system helped them to deal with the tragedy they faced, which was very similar to that faced by the Lawrence family. But that's a stark comparison to the Lawrence family, who will say that the criminal justice system added to the burden that they faced. And G. Walker in particular talked about the importance of the transparency of it being prosecuted as a racist murder, and she quoted Judge Leverson, where she said that his words and the description of the sentencing, which started off to say, your starting point for your minimum tariff, because you're going to get a life sentence, would have been 15 years. Because it's a racist murder, I'm starting at 30 years, and he discounted the guilty plea in age and came up with 22 and 23 years. And what she said, it was the clearest indicator to her and to the society in general, to whether it be victims or perpetrators, that the state was on the side of the victim and that we can't tolerate hate crime. The other really important thing is about the similarities between the two murders. The motivation might have been different, but the similarities, the futility of the crime, the impact on the family, the damage caused to people who would identify or care about people who have similar characteristics, meant that this was part of the reason given by the then government and supported by subsequent governments, that this can't be a hierarchy. We may need to put more resources into racism because there's more racism, but what we're aspiring to is the same degree of protection, and government rejected, and we've rejected subsequently, any hierarchy that says that one is more important than others. So, I won't talk too much about Stephen Hoskins, because I'll talk about him in the second session. But I just wanted to also mention Sophie Lancaster. Sophie, most people know about, a tragic murder, has had lots of publicity in media, and there's been plays and there's been films, lots of documentaries done about her murder. And she was attacked, her boyfriend Robert was attacked because he dressed differently. He was described as a goth in the newspapers, and he wasn't, but that was how he was described. But he looked and dressed differently than the perpetrators. And they attacked him, and Sophie went to his assistance to protect him, and she was fatally injured by the same perpetrators. And I defy anybody to listen to Sylvia, Sophie's mum, explain what went on, and not agree that her murder was a hate crime, because it was. It had every characteristic. It just wasn't one of the characteristics that we measure. So in our guidance, we talk to police forces and police partners about this, and say this is a clearest indication that you have to have a broader response to hate crime than just the monitored areas. So what we say is it's incumbent on police and partners to understand what hostility exists in their area and what fear of crime exists in their area, and where they think they can apply hate crime policy to solve a problem, they should do so. So Greater Manchester, for many reasons, but largely because the northern quarter of Manchester is like a regional hub for people who would describe themselves as alternative subcultures. Because of that case and because of the hostility that existed and that they recognised, they recorded alternative subcultures in their hate crime policy. And they record it locally. They don't submit it as part of the hate crime statistics, but they record it locally. So we'll see. So the issue of disability hate crime is really important. Back in 2007, we were tasked with coming up with this common definition. And we went down and did a consultation and said, what groups do you think should be included in hate crime policy? Because Stephen Lawrence's inquiry was obviously very concerned about racism, but didn't have a remit beyond that. So we came up with 21 groups that people said either could or should be included in hate crime policy, and they ranged out everything from racism, which was kind of on everybody's list, through to people who worked in animal experimentation laboratories, which was on some people's list. And you can kind of see what they were getting at. There was families of people who were working at Huntington Life Sciences at the time who were being attacked because of what their parents were doing as a job of work. So you can kind of see the similarities, but we decided that we needed to go with we needed to draw a line around which ones we were effectively going to measure. And we came up with 5 strands, including disability. Now, disability hadn't been included before, and when we sort of looked at it, some forces did and some forces didn't. When you asked the forces what they were including, for those who did, it was tended to be thefts of blue badges and things like that. They were not necessarily what we... I'm even boring the projector now. So we looked around at disability, and we saw there was some really tragic cases of disabled people being attacked in a prolonged way. What we didn't find is evidence of people who were, these aren't words, but mission disabled in the same way as we saw mission racist. But we saw enough similarities between different crimes that showed that this was a problem that we needed to grapple with on a strategic basis and not seeing it as a series of tragic incidents. And these incidents all took place in 2007. So Stephen Hoskins was a man with learning disability and mental health. He lived in a flat on his own in a fairly rural village of Cornwall. He had money that some of his counterparts didn't, and he befriended a group of youths who realised they were onto a good thing. They realised they got somewhere they could hang out, they could take drugs, they could be in his home. They realised he got money that they hadn't got, so could afford to buy drugs and alcohol, and they could abuse him. And they took him in as a friend. They quickly started to abuse him in a financial way, in a kind of abusive way. And that escalated and escalated and escalated to the point where they made him behave like a dog. They put a dog's lead on him, they made him eat his food in his own home, out of a dog's bowl. They treated him, they dehumanised him. And ultimately, they held him in a kangaroo court, charged with paedophilia, which there was no evidence that he was. And they found him guilty. They made him eat 70 paracetamol, and they frog-marched him to an aqueduct where they dangled him over the edge of the aqueduct, and they took turns in stamping on his fingers until he fell 100 feet to his death. And it was that systematic dehumanisation and abuse of Stephen Hoskins. But that was very similar to what was suffered by Brent Martin, a young lad who at 19 had spent most of his life in institutions, educational health institutions, and came out of what in those days used to be called a sink estate in Sunderland, and realised he wanted friends, and was back with his mother. But all of the people of his similar age had all got friends. They'd all gone through the same education system. They'd all got established friendships. So he started to hang around with groups who were 15, 16. And again, they took advantage of him. They realised he got money, he could buy alcohol. And they ultimately, again, went through this dehumanisation process. They treated him as a plaything. They took bets on who could be the first one to punch him and knock him out with a single punch. And ultimately they stripped him naked, sexually abused him, and beat him to death, leaving him naked in the street. And one of the defenders walked away saying, "I'm not going down for a muppet." It was heard by a witness. And again, difficult to imagine better evidence of hostility. But nobody, not the police, not the social services, not the lawyers, not the family, realised or saw this as a disability hate crime, so it wasn't recorded as such. Christine McKinsky died of natural causes. She died of pancreatic failure in Hartlepool, and she was carrying wood back to her home when she collapsed and died in the street. And while she was dying or dead in the street, a group of youths who'd been tormenting her for weeks started to abuse her, started to taunt her as she lay there, and ultimately poured water over her, put the wood over the top of her and made it into what they decided was a coffin, and they poured shaving foam over her, drew faces on her with shaving foam, and ultimately one of them urinated on her while the other one, another of his friends, recorded it on a mobile phone, saying that this would be fantastic on YouTube. But the reality of it is they couldn't be charged. They were investigated as a possible murder. The medical evidence said that she died of natural causes, so they couldn't even charge with assault, because you can't assault somebody who's dead, and you couldn't prove that she was alive. So he was charged with outrage of public decency and got 3.5 years or 3 years in prison, which was as much as he could have got for that crime. But it showed the disdain that some people had towards disabled people. Most of us, particularly in this region, will remember Fiona Pilkington and Frankie Hardwick, who died in 2007. The element of disability hostility didn't come out until the inquest in 2009. But they had 33 incidents where they needed to call on the police or the local authority to come and protect them from abuse in and around the home. And ultimately, Fiona Pilkington got to the point where she thought the best thing for her daughter was to kill her and kill herself, to protect her from the abuse that she was facing because of her disability and other factors. So it shows that the nature of the dehumanising of people with learning disability and mental ill health in particular was such a real problem that we needed to grapple with it. And the DPP came out with this statement in October 2008, which said that he considered disability hate crime to be a scar on the conscience of the criminal justice system. And when you go back to that issue about the underreporting, you realise just what a key challenge that is. So when you look at the underreporting, if you remember, we said that over half of race hate crimes that the crime survey recognises were recorded, you'll see that it's less than 10%, even with the advanced work that's been done to try and raise awareness. So there's a huge lack of understanding about victims' rights. I would suggest that most black families born, educated and living in this country would know of their right to be treated as a victim of race hate crime if they were subjected to it. They may not choose to tell us for a bunch of reasons, but they would at least know it was their right to be recognised as such. Whereas I would suggest that the majority of disabled people, particularly people with learning disability, don't understand that right. And it makes it much more incumbent on us to reach out and to try and identify these crimes proactively rather than just reactively. So one of the issues is about vulnerability. We have legal definitions of vulnerable people. There are legal reasons why we need to have that definition. But there's a big issue about safeguarding. We were finding examples of people who were seeing that the job was done because they'd considered safeguarding, and I've got a real example of that to show you. And actually they weren't treated as victims. And for me, the answer to safeguarding may be treating people as victims, and the answer to treating people as victims may be safeguarding, but they're not mutually exclusive. And there was examples of where that people were just pushed down one route or the other. So the context is often different. Here's an example which is of Winterbourne View. You may have seen a panorama programme a few years ago that was put out. Just to give you the context, Panorama put an undercover reporter into a place called Winterbourne View. Now Winterbourne View is a place that the state is paying for to protect people from all sorts of needs, to provide needs, but to protect them from harm. And we put people in, and this is a private company that runs it, but we put people in, so these people are being paid.
Simon, please put your trousers up. Here's Wayne again, in the red.
These are Cara as well.
Here's Simone, pinned beneath a chair by Wayne. This isn't restraint, it's a serious assault. Another carer, Graham, wraps a blanket around her head. 30 minutes later, jacket off, Wayne's still there. Simone has been largely passive. And now Graham seems to have her in some kind of headlock, whilst another carer hands out sweets. Seems the same woman who Wayne dragged out of bed in the morning has just attempted to jump out of a second-story window. Wayne's there. Wayne and another carer, Nino, pretend they're in a gangster film. I'll make a phone call and get to what? Then, out of the blue, Wayne leaps on a patient in the corner.
So, deeply depressing. One of the positives, obviously, was that it was exposed by undercover reporting. One of the other positives was those people were prosecuted. That was the end now. These people were prosecuted as, and the sentences were enhanced because of disability hate crime, and some of them went to prison. And kind of what it shows is that we think that we've done a job when, particularly as policing, when somebody is in a place of safety, when things are resolved. But actually that is something where the state has actually sponsored this activity. The thing that probably caused the greatest offence about this from the independent advisory group that advises me and advises the government through our programme is that the BBC did some fantastic work to expose this, but then removed the journalist when the evidence was gathered and didn't tell the police or the local authority or the commissioners about this abuse until the day of the airing of the programme. And they did that because they didn't obviously want it to be sub judice and that people were clearly going to get arrested and charged. So for 3 months those victims were left with those perpetrators in that setting in a way that most of us would imagine that they suffered more when they were removed. And the IED started to explore whether there was a case under the Equality Act against the BBC for making this decision to recklessly, in their view, leave the victims with the perpetrators. Unfortunately, the BBC are covered by the Equality Act only insofar as it affects their business and not in respect of programme making and news, so they were actually exempt from it in this instance. But it showed for me a kind of challenge to a question that we have to ask people, such as the BBC, is have you seen the rights of these people in the same way as you would say, for instance, in relation to children's rights? So if this was exposing child sex abuse, would we have left those victims with those perpetrators having taken this on? So I'd kind of leave you with that in terms of sort of the response. And I'll kind of end it there because I was just going to go into some sort of other issues. You can see the warning probably makes it seem more appealing than it is. But I was just going to talk through some of the issues around abuse of disabled people online, but I'll kind of leave that because we're running out of time. So happy to answer any questions afterwards. So we're going to take the other presentation first and then answer any questions. Thank you.